I propose that first we would exchange some ideas among the panelists, and then the floor will be open for everybody, and of course some interventions into our internal, so to speak, discussions are always welcome. The talks were so rich that it's not quite easy to find the common denominators, but perhaps I would suggest the first topic. In fact, it was suggested during the lunch by somebody else. We have discussed limits of science, and we discussed various disciplines, and of course some limits of scientific explanation were visible in particular disciplines. But now perhaps it's time to look for limits of science as some entirety, science as such, not particular disciplines. And my question is, do you have some comments on that? Is it possible to distill out of our talks some common features of limits of science, science as such? This is the first question.
When people are discussing these limitations of science, it's relatively few sciences who are normally discussed. It's typically physics or the physical sciences, and it's biology. One very rarely hear about the earth sciences, for instance, when it comes to the question of the limitations of science. And there are people who have questioned whether science as a unity exists today. There exist sciences, of course, large areas of science, large disciplines of science, but science as a unity is more perhaps an idea than a reality. So, in a sense, I think when it comes to this limitation problem, not only is the reality is that it's something which is discussed in the physical sciences and branches of the biological sciences, including the neurosciences and mathematics, of course, but that's about all, and that is, in a sense, it is justified. In other big areas of science, such as the earth sciences or botany, scientists don't face these problems. They don't speak about them, as far as I know.
Do you have some comments on that? I would add an observation that there are perhaps some limits in between the sciences. For instance, there are strict sciences. Sometimes they are called hard sciences, and there are soft sciences, like human sciences. They are, a bit ironically, sometimes called soft sciences, especially among philosophers. Hard philosophy is a British analytical philosophy, and soft philosophy is literary reflections on. Okay, so in Polish language and perhaps in other Slavic languages, we have the problem because the same term, science, is referred to both human sciences and strict sciences. In English, sciences are only strict and are some arts or some literary things. What about this limit, which can boundary line between the sciences?
Well, if I can make a comment. Well, I think one of the reasons we have most of the discussion on the limits of science is within physics, is that physics uses the most rigid methods of explanation. They're the most rigid methods of discovery, which is mathematics. So I think in that sharp as when we have very, very precise rules on how to proceed in proving different things, then the questions of the limits come in the sharp focus. But let's say in other natural sciences like biology, or like we said here, geography or geology or whatever, botany, I think the rules of explanations are sort of more intuitive, and I think it's in some ways even hard to identify the problem where actually we do face the limits, right? Because in physics it's easy because we say, well, the method of physics is mathematics, and we sort of understand the limits of mathematics, and it becomes clear. But in other natural sciences, I think the understanding of explanation, the understanding of proving things is much more intuitive, and the concepts are not as sharp. And I think we might have from just the method itself, difficulty in really saying what we would define as limits of knowledge in that area. So that's my intuitive approach to what I would kind of a line that I would like to draw between the hardcore sciences and the soft ones, let's say biology. I think it just that we can't get our hand on the method as precisely as in the physical sciences, and it limits us in sort of bringing out the limits of that science.
Could we say that strict sciences are methodologically easier, and everything is, so to speak, on the surface? Well, not quite on the surface, but they are methodologically easier. Whereas human sciences are methodologically more difficult. It's another story that perhaps to study strict sciences is, at least for some people, more difficult. But science are more easily visible in these methodologically easier sciences.
I think that, I mean, on the one hand, it's true that when you're speaking about, well, first of all, I think that this, to reserve the term science for what in the English sense, and to distinguish it from social studies and the humanist field studies is useful. The German Wissenschaften includes all kinds of sciences. I mean, on the one hand, it's certainly relevant to discuss the relationship between the natural sciences and then, for instance, the social sciences. Psychology is certainly it's a sort of field which is, in some respect, between. But if we go to the proper fields of the humanist studies, and history is the paradigm example of humanist studies, and it's not that history and the other philosophy, literature theory and things like that are more complicated only, but in a sense they are. They are less disciplined maybe. They certainly can make no experiments, unfortunately. But they operate with ways of explanation which has no place at all in the natural sciences. The standard explanation in history is based on the intentions that people have to make certain actions, intentional explanation, which you cannot do history without speaking of people's intentions. But there's no way of translating intentional explanation into the world of the natural sciences. The stars have no intentions. They are just born and they die.
Scientists can do that.
Yes. So if we use totally different categories of explanation, one should be very careful to make comparisons.
And by the way, what do you think? Is there any difference between history of science and history in general?
Fundamentally, no, according to my view. History of science is just one part of the much broader field of history. Just as well as we have history of art, we have history of architecture, then it's perfectly natural that we have history of science.
I wouldn't agree, because history of science follows development of some ideas which are in some way rationalized by history too. So it is not so with art or other humanities.
People compare economics to art, so it also does the same with physics. I think that is like the end of history of some ideas, and ideas can be also in arts, can be also in poetry, can be also in physics or mathematics.
Okay. I don't see any ideas, particular ideas in arts. Ideas of this in the sense of scientific ideas.
Not only, I mean the ideas that, for example, are behind some trends, for example, arts.
Trends.
Because, for example, we can see the same in physics. Because, for example, physics nowadays is much different from the physics like half thousand years ago. And at that point, there was also some physics, but it was quite different. Just like, for example, architecture or poetry or arts.
No, but
was quite different.
No, but I believe in continuity in development of science, natural science, and I think it is rather fashion which goes with the development of architecture and art and so on. I don't mean the technical development. I mean the decorative development.
Please go on.
The solution is that I read the book of Professor Haller when you say that Karl Popper gives the third word, which is a word of scientific ideas, and when we talk about history, we talk about the history of human, of what has done in the world. So maybe this is a clue to this, if I understood you well.
I think that we are entering into the field of methodology of history, which is a separate subject. A very exciting one, and of course very relevant for our discussion of philosophy in science and limits of science. Please.
Yes, I think one of the main differences in which way we would distinguish the history of science from the history in general, as we understand it, is that, as we said, the sciences have different methods. I mean, history doesn't repeat itself. I mean, in history you don't have a controlled experiment. In science, you do. So I think you can. It's a very, in some ways, it's a different path. Knowledge develops, and it's a different path of probably justifying and explaining things in history. So, from the methodological point of view, I think they're quite distinct. And I think the key point is that history doesn't repeat itself. So we don't have that thing which we have in physics, where we can, do the experiment a million times.
Okay, if we are discussing history, perhaps the question relevant for our seminar would be what could we learn from the history of science about limits of science? And I address that question to Professor Frank.
Yes, I'm afraid that I have to say that my brief answer would be disappointingly little. I mean, on the one hand, we know from the history of science that what previously had been thought to be limits of science, they have been routinely transgressed. In the old days, there were a lot of questions that philosophers and scientists believed could never be answered scientifically, and it had been proved that they were wrong. I mean, in 1833, there is a famous quotation from Auguste Comte, the famous philosopher and father of positivism, in which he says that we will never ever know anything scientifically about the constitution of the stars. That is impossible. That's an absolute limit. He was totally wrong. That has happened all the time. But we cannot extrapolate from these successes and therefore conclude that there are no limits to scientific knowledge. So, I mean, in general, on the one hand, we can and we should learn from history, because in a certain sense, this is the only empirical field that we can know anything from. It would be stupid not to learn from the successes and mistakes of history. But the message of history is diverse and complex. It's not a success story, but it's not a story of mistakes either. So I think that it's almost impossible to come up with any predictions about the present state of science, even more impossible to say anything reasonably about the future state of science on a historical basis. History can be used for many things, but generally it's a bad instrument of prediction. I mean, we know that from social and economic history, and I think that it is valid for science history as well.
The distinction between the limits of science and the limits of scientific method perhaps would be helpful. Are there some limits of method? Because limits of method, if there are any, would affect all sciences and not only in that particular epoch. So it is a question for everybody. Please.
I would like to add something to the discussion about the limits of science. I think the limit of the for sure script science is a God. And my question is, can the script science say something about God? As you said in your as you said, we can only say negatively about the God. And in my opinion, script, as I said, script science can say nothing. And I don't know what about humanistic science.
Somebody wants to comment on that problem.
It depends, for example, on what you mean by verifying some examples of truth about the God. Because, for example, Saint Thomas Aquin, he had, because he was, from his life, he was writing about God, not always negatively, but also very positively. It means that he was doing some statements about him. And at the end of his life, he had revelation, because he was wondering all the time if his thesis in theology were right about the essence of God, and he had the revelation that the God told him that Thomas, you wrote well about me.
Yeah.
And in terms of science itself, well, I think that it depends on how you define it, because, for example, if we focus on, let's say, writings of Father Buchański, that for example, we can derive the statement that if we define a strict border between science as a field which describes the real world and the theology which describes the transcendental world, then there is no way we can learn something about the transcendental world using the positivist science.
But metaphysics.
No, I mean that then we cannot learn anything about God using the science which describes the physical world, which is
I agree with this.
So now we are identified another borderline. One was between sciences and strict sciences and soft sciences, and now we are discussing the borderline between the science and theology or religion, which is also a touchy point, religion or theology, because there are two different things. Usually, if there is any conflict between science and religion, it is not between science and religion, but theology, some interpretation of religion, which is a theology. And this is, of course, a very important problem, also touching the problem of limits. I think that in the near future we will have a seminar, especially devoted to this relation between science and theology. But of course, it does not mean that it is forbidden to discuss that topic now.
But before the seminar, one can just look in some of your books where you speak as a scientist also about theology in a positive way. That means that science can give us some hints about some ideas which we never had before, and they can be applied in our thinking about eternity and God and so on. And science forms our mental background, also in respect to religious things. This is what I meant.
Yes, because if I may add also one remark, also Henry Buchensky stated that theology is much similar to, for example, physics, because physics takes some data which comes from the physical world and then uses mathematical formalism to derive some results, and theology, for example, does similar things in terms of theology, the world which is not physical. Because it takes, for example, data that comes from revelation, and then it applies logical formulas, which, as a matter of fact, is the clue, and then it takes some results from that formulation of ideas.
No, I did not mean this. I meant that we still live in some world of ideas, and we are fed by these ideas. In the ancient time they were different, now they are the same. And still, the religion, in many cases at least, uses the old ideas, and without some transformation of this background, we will not be able to progress in our thinking about
yes.
transcendental things.
Yes, but there is transformation, huge one, because from the times of Saint Augustine across the Middle Ages, there has been a great transformation.
But I mean now.
Now
we think in the terms of our fathers.
I think that it's also very interesting talking. There is something which could be called the scientific image of the world, which is a very rough idea, but I think it's very powerful in the history. There was different image of the world in the biblical times, the Middle Ages, and the Newtonian image of the world, the relativistic. Well, perhaps the good question would be, which is the scientific image of the world of the contemporary people? Probably the answer would be hopeless. There are many, and probably the majority of these images has nothing to do with the sciences, perhaps with Harry Potter or some other TV vision of science. But but in the history, this image of the world was changing, and it was a powerful stimulus to the development of theology, I think. So, please.
Going back to Robert's question, and also to what Professor Hurd said.
A bit louder because it's better acoustic here.
I try. I think that the question if sciences can say anything about God depends also on the problem of natural theology, and if we think it is legitimate. Because if it is, and if we can, let's say, think about God not directly, but let's say in the mirror of the world, then sciences which say something about the world can say something about God. But if not, it would be more difficult, definitely.
So it's an old metaphor of two books.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a long history. Okay. Some questions?
Perhaps I'll just note that, just a brief comment. I mean, this discussion, but also the theme of this discussion evidently has been very abstract, very philosophical, very much based on ideas and mathematical developments and things like that. But I think that perhaps we should not forget the enormous epistemic power there is in instruments, in high-tech instruments, and that a lot of the progress we have experienced in science ever since Galileo has not been due to clever new ideas, but has been due to advances in instrument technology, in which there is a very clear economic factor. For instance, what we know positively about the very early universe cosmology is more or less directly dependent on satellite observations of the cosmic microwave background, state-of-the-art technology. And it's one of the, you mentioned the methods of science, and surely the experimental method it's not the method, but it's very important and stable elements, I would say, since the day of Galileo and until the present. Well, it's just to point out that this more, in a sense, more mundane, more hands-on aspect of science is an important part of the picture. Science is not only something going on in our heads, it's also very much a manual affair.
It is very strictly connected with the very concept of experimental science. And that's my old idea, that as science progresses, then the experiment is more and more infiltrating theory, and theory is more and more infiltrating experiment. If you take, for instance, the big accelerators like the one in CERN, so it is a big theoretical factory. Without theory, it would be impossible to construct and then to have data, and if somebody gave out the data, nobody would be able to interpret them. So it's, I would say, non-linear mixing of experiments and theory, and this, I think, should be regarded as a positive thing. The science is more and more experimental because of that.
Yeah. However, if one thinks pessimistically, the development of technology may also work against the development of science, because as others, several species in the evolution also disappeared, so humans in some way are developing in this direction that they may ruin the culture by themselves, unfortunately.
If I may add one also remark as well, I think that the case, the great danger which is connected with the development is wrong, because as for example I was discussing with some of my friends at CERN lately, because when comparing, honestly, when you compare the complexity, I mean the complexity in terms of some ideas behind it, or for example the experiments that had been carried on like some time ago, and for example the experiments nowadays in particle physics, for example HC, the complexity, I would say, that was connected with the experiments some time ago was much bigger, and these experiments were much more complicated, because what we do, for example, at HC is simply crushing some particles with bigger and bigger energy, while it's not very, I think, complicated in terms of the ideas behind it.
Rather complicated.
It's complicated in terms of some technology behind it, but I wouldn't say it's complicated to do that from the very beginning.
Maybe there are not enough, maybe the technology also kills great ideas in physics. Could be that these details are important, but these details also influence the great ideas, so it is very difficult to predict how it will eventually work.
Yes, because obviously there is a kind of crisis in physics, but when we have a look at, for example, the history of physics, we see that such periods were quite important and quite relevant at some parts of the time. Because, for example, also like 100 years ago, there was also maybe not 100, but like 120 years ago, there was people thought that, for example, it's useless to study physics because all has been done, all had been done before, and then emerged the examples of radiation, etc. That started again. So I think think these periods of economic crisis are like a long one, but then something happens suddenly and then we have a breakthrough.
No, I don't think there is a crisis in physics. I don't think so. I cannot see the crisis in physics. Just there are many. The works go into details, but there are no new ideas. That doesn't mean that they are not. They are somewhere hidden.
Well, we are dedicating to a very specific problem, but there is or there is not crisis in physics. It's a big problem. It's a big problem. Some people claim that all these multiverse theories and so many people working on the superstring is a sign of a crisis. But well, it is a bad thing. I have one question, but please.
Back to my questions about science. We are discussing about science from inside, and I think the philosophical distance is very important. And I saw that it's not so easy to answer the questions about the limits of science, because science is from one side limited and then from the other side unlimited. I can't imagine a time without science, but I can't imagine a moment when I understand all, and all the people I understand all. It's impossible because our structure as a man make it impossible. We are no gods. The ancient said this dangerous moment is Hybris. So the moment when man thinks he has such a understanding like a god. It's, I think, impossible because they can't realize such a situation and accept such a situation. But for other side, I think it's another problem because there are two questions in the problem of science. One is when we ask you why, how it works. But how it works, okay, we can develop the answer of the questions, but we have other question. Why? And I think that's a very important thing. Sometimes I think that now people are thinking that when we know how, it's the same that the answer that we know why. No, I think that's the problem. Really, that the limit lies here, that we can't understand why. Maybe we can understand how it works better. I don't know at all. So the limits of science lie inside the science, and in our possibility to understand the word and our limit.
The problem touches the problem. Is there a science without limits? Is it possible or not? And this is my question to you. Mathematics seems to be the science without limits. At least the field of interest of mathematics seems to be infinite. What you could comment on that?
Well, on the one hand, there are some limits in mathematics. We know them, for example, from Gödel, yeah? The axiomatic method, which is, well, the main method in mathematics, has some limits, yeah? And we know about those limits. That's the very interesting thing, that we can prove in a strict way that there are some limits, and we know where is the source of the limits, yeah? And we know also that those limits cannot be overcome, yeah? Because we know we can simply add new axioms, but there will be still new undecidable statements, yeah? But on the other hand, the history of mathematics shows that we can invent new methods, yeah, and solve the old problems. For example, this theorem of Fermat, yeah, which was open for many years, yeah, and at the end there were some new methods, very sophisticated methods, very far from number theory, yeah, which helped us to solve the problem. Yeah, maybe Hilbert was right when he said that there is no ignorabimus in mathematics. Wir müssen wissen, wir werden wissen. Yeah, we must know and we shall know. Because there are two sides of the problem.
Yeah.
Two sides.
So paradoxically, mathematics seems to be the only science which is able to prove the existence of its limits.
Yeah, exactly. But you know,
in spite of the common belief that it is infinite and almost omnipotent.
When it is so, you know, when you restrict yourself to axiomatic methods and to formal methods, yeah. But when normal mathematicians are using also other methods which are not so formalizable, and then the other side of the picture.
Unfortunately, you must slowly approach the time limits of our meeting. Not yet, but slowly. So I would ask a general question. Are there some important questions and new directions in our discussions? Please notice that the discussion and our seminar is registered. And we can have a great fun to look at that one day if you want. Well, it was an interesting question. Is there the limiting line between how and why? Somebody has something to tell about. It was indeed some time ago believed, especially in the positivist-like methodology, that it is strictly forbidden to the sciences to answer why. But I think that if we look at the theoretical physics, so the difference between these two questions becomes more and more fuzzy. Do you want to?
No, I just want to ask you a question, whether you believe that they are so distinct that you answered before I asked.
Mm-hmm. Because I think that if we have a good mathematical model of a phenomenon, it says
both
why it happens, because it cannot be otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
Especially as some hunters of the final
and
theory claim that the only one theory is possible, one theory of everything, because a little small change in that theory would ruin everything. So it would be answer why it happens.
But also how.
No,
how it happens too.
So these two
answers both questions.
Yeah, of course, if you include into the question of how the moral dimension, how means finality, a goal, then of course it's another story. But it is a different how.
So it's different how to understand these two.
Yeah, I think there's also, I think we should, I think one of the areas that could give us more insight into the limits of the limits of knowledge in general is neuroscience, because it's the science proper today which sort of studies our mechanisms of brain processes, and maybe in future we'll be able to say more about the limits of science just by knowing how the brain works. I don't know if that's a legitimate way, but in principle it could be. Maybe really more limits of knowledge will be revealed as we discover more and more about the brain, because eventually this is the brain which has knowledge, right? So at least we think so. So hopefully, maybe if more is being known about the brain, about the formation of concepts, in particular, how we form concepts in our brain, is this a limiting case, or now can we expand our concepts infinitely and try to adjust them to explain phenomena of physics or something? Do we have a limit in expanding our conceptual capacity. Maybe I can only. So I think that will be the answer to neuroscience eventually.
But I would think that this is the history which will tell us whether we will have limits in this respect or not. But probably neuroscience can also give some hints. But probably rather history of human being.
There is one very interesting number which applies to the brain, because from what I know, it's necessary to describe only one neuron. It's necessary to use like 30,000 differential equations. So let's then multiply this number by the number of the neurons in the brain, and we'll get a number that is probably, I think, lots times bigger than the number of the particles in the universe. So I think that's the heart of the complexity. And then now let's multiply it by the number of people on the Earth. So.
Well, that's small compared probably to the numbers.
Well, the problem of limits becomes urgent, and if somebody has enough courage to try to summarize our seminar, so I should take that risk. It will not be a summarizing, in fact, but some reflections to close the seminar. I think we witnessed to several lectures which were very fascinating and gave us a lot of thinking. But I think that we have observed during the lectures that indeed there is a sort of invasion of particular scientific disciplines into philosophy. Neuroscience is an example. It's a young discipline, and it infiltrates into philosophy. I would say that nowadays to do epistemology, like Kant's epistemology, without knowing neuroscience would be an anachronism. The same thing, with philosophy of nature without knowing some cosmological things. So there is invasion of disciplines, especially young disciplines, into philosophy. So philosophy in science, but just we can reverse this slogan and say that is science in philosophy. And I think this could be regarded as a small achievement of our seminar, that we have a dual formulation, philosophy in science and science in philosophy, and both ways of thinking are extremely important. And I think another conclusion out of our discussion, a conclusion both from the papers presented during this seminar and during the discussion, is that the role of history of science in discussing especially some meta-scientific problems are enormous. And this is not perhaps a revelation, because nowadays there are many departments in the world in which philosophy and science is combined with history of science. There are journals which combine the two, history, studies in the history and philosophy of modern physics, for instance, a very, very well-known journal. So this is not a discovery, but it is worthwhile to remember about that. So, is it possible to do history of science without a bit of philosophy of science? I think it will be very difficult, even if somebody is enemy of philosophy. The enmity of philosophy is a sort of philosophy. So we have formulation, some philosophy in the history of science, and vice versa. There must be some history of science in the philosophy, in general, and in philosophy of science in particular. So history is a magistra vitae. So this I think is quite important things. And I think we have learned also something else during this seminar, that philosophy is present not only in science, is present not only in the philosophy of science, but in philosophy in general. In big philosophical questions like the human destiny, the God problem, or morality, nowadays it is impossible to do all these branches of philosophy without mentioning science. So at least through this scientific image of the world, I think that we cannot go to more detailed conclusions because it's perhaps impossible, but these few general lines I think are quite interesting to be remembered and perhaps summarized at the end of the work which will come out of this conference. So I think thank once more to all speakers, to the wonderful audience, and to very wonderful organizers, especially those who are not quite visible during the discussions because they have many other obligations. Thank you very much, and see you soon again.